Hello, I'm Tony Spearman Leach, the Director of Development and Communications here at Montgomery Community Media, Montgomery Community Television, your community media center. Of course, you are the backbone of our organization, and we are pleased to present this opportunity to have a community dialogue and the second installment of the Josiah Henson Leadership Conference. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce to you one of Montgomery County's, and indeed the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area's great leaders, and a great partner for both the Montgomery County Parks Foundation and Montgomery Community Media. And that person is Debbie Jarvis, the Vice President of Corporate Relations and Corporate Social Responsibility at PEPCO. And PEPCO is the sponsor of this series. Debbie Jarvis has served previously as the Vice President of an award-winning corporate communications team at PEPCO. Of course, we all know about her great merger opportunity, and it is now PEPCO Exelon, who is going to create greater partnerships here in our region, and we are pleased that they are going to join with us in advancing community engagement. Ms. Jarvis has served also, as you all may know, as the news anchor previously for NBC4 in Washington. We've seen our faces. She's brought us the news, and today, like she's always done, she's bringing us together to discuss issues that are really relevant to us at this time. More importantly, she's a big force here in our nonprofit community. She is the board chair for Leadership Montgomery. She is the board chair for the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Washington. She is still on their executive committee for the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Washington. She also has served on the boards of the Washington, D.C. Police Foundation, the D.C. Education Fund, the Washington Area Women's Foundation, and good God knows her list goes on and on and on. But more importantly, she's here for us today as our moderator and our facilitator for the Josiah Henson Leadership Conference. And most importantly, she's done what she's always done. She's connecting us to issues that are relevant and making our community a better place to live. So it is my distinguished honor to present to you Ms. Debbie Jarvis.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, everyone. I am so honored to be here with you all today. Our first session, fantastic discussion, and I know we're going to continue on. So I just want to say thank you, everyone in the audience. Thank you, viewers, for joining us for the second Josiah Henson Leadership Conference. This session is the second one of two in this conference, as I mentioned, and Tony's already told you who I am. Yes, I am Debbie Jarvis. And it is a pleasure to serve as your moderator and host for these conference sessions. And also, PEPCO is really proud and so honored to sponsor engaging educational opportunities and to partner with communities to work together in solving our challenges and celebrating our accomplishments. And today we are discussing the impact and relevance of the writings of Reverend Josiah Henson, and we are introducing the Josiah Henson Park Museum, an educational center that will be built in Rockville near the Pike and Rose development. Reverend Henson was an Underground Railroad conductor from right here in Rockville, Maryland. His autobiography and legacy speak of self-determination and freedom. And then later, as you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin based upon Josiah Henson's autobiography. During this session, we are going to further explore today's relevance of Reverend Josiah Henson's works and legacy on how we talk about the ripple effects of slavery, emancipation, and race relations in the 21st century. It is my pleasure, though, to introduce to you the chair of the Josiah Henson Campaign Committee, the best person for this job, the First Lady of Montgomery County, Catherine Leggett. Catherine?
Well, we are so delighted that you are here with us for the second half of today's discussion, this conversation. I want to take a moment again to acknowledge the great granddaughter, Mia Lewis of Josiah Henson. Please stand. She has joined us. She has joined us from Charlotte, North Carolina, and she indicated to me earlier that her whole family from Michigan and all over the country is streaming in. So hello, family out there. This is such an important event. This is such an important project. We must ensure that our community knows about this park, that they engage and they learn, and they know about the work that Reverend Henson did right here, starting in Montgomery County. So we saw a little video earlier. So we're going to see the second part of it. Many of Henson's experiences of living as a slave on the Riley Plantation was vividly depicted in the autobiography and are created in Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. As you saw in the first video, the Dawn site in Canada includes a visitor center where guests can experience a story of his life. The Josiah Henson Project envisions a similar museum and educational facility to be located on the very property where Henson was enslaved. Let's watch and learn a little bit more from the video.
The small white house sitting at the end of a driveway off Old Georgetown Road in Montgomery County was once the center of a 300-acre plantation. In 1795, it was home to more than 20 slaves, including Josiah Henson and his mother. Henson refers to the house, the plantation and slave owner Isaac Riley, in his memoir, The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave. He also described the log cabin-style structure on the side of the house as a kitchen. Henson once slept in such a log cabin. Marbles, eggshells, and a sad iron are among the 8,000 artifacts already unearthed here by archaeologists. They've uncovered 3 layers of packed dirt floors, indicating the possibility that there were several structures here before this cabin.
That's a good question.
The slave quarters, barns, and other original buildings where Henson and his family lived and worked are lost to time. For now. Montgomery Parks Foundation archaeology volunteers patiently scrape the soil, then sift it, looking for artifacts to tell us where Henson might have lived on the property. The former plantation is now called Josiah Henson Park. It is the only place in the U.S. open to the public with a direct connection to his life. Marylanders of all ages are already taking advantage of the history the spot offers. The original plantation has dwindled in size to about 2 acres of softly rolling Maryland hills and stately pines. Montgomery Parks Foundation and the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission are now working together to breathe new life into this historic setting. Together, the 2 organizations plan to restore the historic house, add exhibits, trails, and gardens, and build a modern visitor center. The new Josiah Henson Park Museum and Education Center will be an educational and reflective retreat designed to tell the story of human triumph in the face of adversity.
And we want to bring life not only to his story, his memory, his legacy, but we want to bring life to the conversation. We want people talking. We want people engaged. We want people knowing. We want people to understand how important his life was to our country. And so I would like to bring Debbie back to start the conversation with our panel.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. So, everyone, just as a little reminder there, that you can, too, support this effort by going to josiahhenson.org. Hope you do that. So at this time, I would like to introduce to you our distinguished panelist, who will discuss the topic of language. How do we talk about the ripple effects of slavery, emancipation, and race relations in the 21st century? Let me introduce you to our panelists first before the discussion begins. We have Melanie Bates, and Melanie was the 2014-2015 president of the Greater Washington Area Chapter Women's Lawyers Division, National Bar Association. We also have Dr. Adina Spingarn, who received her PhD in English from Harvard University and is an expert on the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. We also have with us Montgomery County Council member Craig Rice, who was the youngest African American to ever serve on the 9-member council and only the second African American man to serve in that role. Thank you all for joining us today. We also have in our midst, who's just coming around the corner, and I'll just go ahead and introduce Stephanie Young. She is the Associate Director in the White House Office of Public Engagement, where she serves as President Obama's primary liaison to the African American community. Thank you all for being able to join us today. We're actually going to start with Melanie. And Melanie, I'm going to call you up here so that you'll get a chance to share your thoughts about language. How do we talk about the ripple effects of slavery, emancipation, and race relations in the 21st century? Melanie?
Good morning. And thank you, Debbie, for that introduction. And thank you also to First Lady Leggett and the entire staff here at Montgomery County Media for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm excited to celebrate Josiah Henson for his invaluable contribution to our history. As mentioned, my name is Melanie Bates. I was born and raised in Fairfax County, Virginia, but I reside in the District of Columbia. I have a passion for criminal justice reform. The focus of my remarks today will be on that. When I first read the topic of this panel, language, how do we talk about the ripple effects of slavery, emancipation, and race relations in the 21st century, I immediately thought of slavery and the ripple effects that led to America's addiction to mass incarceration. The United States has 5% of the world's population, but is home to 25% of the world's prison population. I'm going to say that again. The United States has 5% of the world's population, but is home to 25% of the world's prison population. There are more than 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States. 1 in 110 adults are incarcerated in a prison or local jail, and 1 in 35 adults are under some form of correctional control, including prison, jail, parole, or probation. It is important to note that some of these people are innocent. Almost 2,000 wrongfully convicted people have been exonerated for crimes they did not commit. To me, these numbers are absolutely shocking and should not be tolerated. I cannot imagine anything worse than being imprisoned. You are stripped of your liberty. You are told when to eat, sleep, and use the restroom. You are referred to as a number. Like slavery, incarceration is dehumanizing. In some places, once you are labeled a felon, you cannot vote. You are denied access to employment, housing, education, public benefits, and jury service. You have been released from prison, but you are not free. Incarceration affects the African American community more than any other race. Just as Professor Jackson noted earlier, blacks in the District of Columbia aren't doing too well. In DC, the prisoner population is disproportionately black as compared to the district's total population. 91% of DC prisoner population is black, but blacks make up less than half of the total population. By contrast, only 3% of DC's prisoners population is white, but whites make up 43.4% of the district's total population. Unlike the rest of the 50 states, DC is subject to control and oversight by the United States Congress. One result of this control is that sentenced felons in DC are required to be transferred to the Federal Bureau of Prisons once sentenced. Before the enactment of the Revitalization Act, many of those prisoners had been housed in the Lorton complex in Northern Virginia. But in 2001, DC ceased operations in Lorton. This means that our incarcerated residents are sent all across the country to serve their time. This makes reentry support so much more difficult. There are approximately 60,000 DC residents with criminal records. Each year, an estimated 8,000 residents return home after serving their prison sentences. Our returning citizens face an overwhelming amount of obstacles and burdens when attempting to piece back their lives. Think about it. Imagine being dropped off on a street corner with nothing but the clothes on your back after being isolated from society for decades. How would you eat? Where would you sleep? Would you know how to get a driver's license? Get a job? Probably not. Without adequate support and resources, returning citizens are often lost and forced to fend for themselves. It is therefore not at all surprising that within 3 years of release, about 68% of released prisoners are rearrested. Within 5 years of release, about 77% of released prisoners are rearrested. Of those who are rearrested, more than half are arrested by the end of their first year home. The majority of incarcerated persons are low income, have little education, and struggle with mental illness. Many of the reasons people end up behind bars relate to actions taken in order to just survive. I think each of us in this room have an obligation to reach out to our incarcerated brothers and sisters to let them know that we care. They are not alone, that there are support systems available. Just as Mr. Reed stated earlier, let's get our people on the right track and direct them to the right train. There are many ways we can support incarcerated persons to free themselves from the perpetuating cycle of incarceration. I'm on the advisory board of an organization called Free Minds Book Club and Writing Workshop. Free Minds uses books, creative writing, and peer support to awaken DC youth incarcerated as adults to develop their own potential. Just as Josiah Henson did, we recognize that books and creative writing have the incredible power to teach, build community, inspire individuals, and change lives. Our book club and writing workshop meets every week at the DC jail, where juvenile inmates come together to discuss work of contemporary literature and write poetry. We tell our members that while your body may not be free, you can keep your mind free with books and writing. So I'd like to close with a poem by one of our members named Larry. It's called 100 Years Ago. 100 and some years ago, they brought us to this land. 100 and some years ago, I couldn't be a man. 100 and some years ago, they called us a slave. 100 and some years ago, they made us behave. 100 and some years ago, they made us figure. 100 and some years ago, my name was A. 100 and some years ago, they made us wear chains. 100 and some years ago, and it's still the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Wow, I got chills when you read that. It was very powerful. All right, now to Dr. Dina Spingarn, who earned her PhD in English at Harvard, and so we would consider you truly a language expert. So we're looking for your insight on our topic today. Dr. Spingarn.
Good morning. Thank you to the Josiah Henson Campaign Committee and Montgomery Community Media for inviting me to be here today. I'm really delighted to be part of a conference that recognizes Josiah Henson's important place in American history. As all of us gathered here today now know, Harriet Beecher Stowe cited Josiah Henson as her inspiration for Uncle Tom, the hero of her history-changing 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Today, of course, being an Uncle Tom means being a hat-in-hand, submissive race trader, something no one wants to be. So it might seem that the association with Uncle Tom would be a potential challenge for an institution dedicated to Josiah Henson, a challenge that should be quickly surmounted by making sure that museum goers know that both Stowe's Uncle Tom and Henson himself were actually selfless, courageous leaders. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the Christ-like Uncle Tom of Stowe's novel became the deplorable race trader the name connotes today, as well as how this figure has helped Americans, black and white, engage with the legacy of slavery. That's the subject of my first book, which I'm just about to complete. It's actually due to my publisher on July 1st. So I'm really nearing the end there. So first, I should say a word about the character of Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom's Cabin. In Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom is a deeply Christian man who is confident in himself even as he is humble before God. While he will not escape from slavery himself nor engage in violence, his humility does not stop him from encouraging a fellow slave to escape with her son, nor from asserting himself verbally, especially when it comes to his Christian faith and to protecting others. Now, in the eyes of many 19th century African Americans, Uncle Tom was a selfless character whose Christ-like submission merited respect, even if not for some emulation as a protest strategy. Frederick Douglass, for example, rejected this character as a personal example, but he also expressed appreciation for him in his autobiographies. To Douglass, as to many other black activists of his time, the community was enriched both by those like Uncle Tom, who survived by religious faith, and by those who survived by more aggressive resistance. One could disagree with Uncle Tom's patient, self-sacrificing Christianity, but one could not deny its fundamental role in the survival of the race. Given Uncle Tom's meaning during the mid-19th century, it should be no surprise that Josiah Henson himself took up the association with Uncle Tom's Cabin and ran with it. After Stowe's novel was published in 1852, he revised and reprinted his previously published autobiography, retitling it Truth is Stranger Than Fiction, in 1858, and then came out with an additional extended version, Uncle Tom's Story of His Life, in 1877. He also made tours of the United States and England as the real Uncle Tom and the original Uncle Tom for the rest of his life. In the advertisements for his tours and for his book, Uncle Tom's name got more prominent billing than his own. In Henson's third autobiography, he wrote of his pride in his association with Stowe's character and with a novel that had been so transformational in American history. And he claimed many people he knew as the examples for characters in Stowe's novel. How then did Uncle Tom get such a bad reputation? To answer this question, we have to look back to the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Stowe's novel was the best-selling book of the 19th century after the Bible. It sold 300,000 copies in the United States in its first year alone, and 1 million copies between the United States and Britain. It was a sensation all over the world, translated into more than a dozen languages. It was really just all over the place, and really the first American book to make such a huge international splash. Now, it's difficult for us today to recognize just how revolutionary this novel was in American culture. Slave narratives published before Uncle Tom's Cabin, including Henson's own, gave white readers a chance to consider the inhumanity of slavery and the humanity of African Americans, but these sold in limited numbers and generally to readers who already held abolitionist sympathies. Stowe's best-selling novel was different. It introduced hundreds of thousands of readers, millions all over the world, to understand how cruel the institution of slavery really was, and it showed that slaves were human beings with deep feelings and precious souls. Readers from every walk of life who probably had never encountered a black character in a novel in their lives in any kind of major role, they wept in sympathy for the cruel plight of Uncle Tom and his fellow slave, Eliza. Now, from the moment Uncle Tom's Cabin entered American culture, it inspired wave upon wave of political and material responses. Writers, artists, and business people adapted Stowe's work in virtually every medium, from theater to card games. It's kind of like contemporary merchandising. For something that's a big hit, everyone wants to make products connected to it. As many Americans as read the novel, many more went to the theater to see one and often more of the many dramatizations of Uncle Tom's Cabin. These plays, too, were part of the anti-slavery influence of Stowe's novel. At the same time, however, Southern whites protested that Stowe's book got both the institution of slavery and the character of slaves entirely wrong. They insisted that such horrors never or rarely happened, and that no black man could ever be as virtuous as Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom's Cabin played a crucial role in bringing about the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. Even Abraham Lincoln acknowledged this influence. There's a famous story that when Lincoln met Stowe in the White House, he said, "So this is the little lady who wrote the book that started this great war." Now, it's not clear whether or not he actually said that, but it was in fact a sentiment that many Americans, black and white, all over the nation, across the political spectrum, shared. Many, many people believed that Stowe's novel was a fundamental impetus for the Civil War. Now, some people thought that that was a problem, and other people celebrated that. Now, the novel's political impact also reached far beyond the issue of slavery to the very humanity of African Americans. In an era in which slaves counted as 3/5 of a person and could not testify in a trial, among other lack of rights, an era when the superiority of Anglo-Saxons over Africans was widely considered a fact, even in the scientific community, Uncle Tom was the first humanized, even glorified representation of a black person that many whites had encountered. Because of this, Stowe's hero became the center of the first major national conversation, not only about slavery, but also about black character. Now, in the past, scholars have assumed that Uncle Tom became a derogatory figure in the many dramatic adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin that appeared on American stages. However, as my research has shown, the figure's derogatory meaning did not, in fact, emerge in the theater. Well into the Jim Crow era, black audiences actually received the Uncle Tom's Cabin dramas as works with radical political potential. And in fact, also well into the 20th century, there were states and cities in the United States that refused to let Uncle Tom's Cabin plays or films show in theaters. The truth is, the transformation of Uncle Tom is as complicated as is the history of race in America. Even once the Civil War settled the issue of slavery's legality, the institution's legacy remained open for discussion, as did the fate of the 4 million newly freed African Americans. Thanks to the continued popularity of Stowe's novel, as well as its many adaptations for the stage, Uncle Tom's Cabin remained the nation's most visible image of slavery, and Uncle Tom the most famous slave. Stowe's novel and the many adaptations it inspired served as a central, ever-contested site for the nation's continuing debates about the memory of slavery, the meaning of the Civil War, and the future of American race relations. Stowe's novel and its characters did not just influence how whites saw blacks, but also, as I'd like to suggest, how black folks saw themselves and their history. In the late 19th century, and really sometimes even today, both blacks and whites often called the era of slavery the days of Uncle Tom. And Uncle Tom generally signified an antebellum slave. This lasting slave status was fundamental to his transformation into a derogatory slur. As a perpetual slave, Uncle Tom held an increasingly fraught meaning for African Americans over the course of the 19th century. On one hand, Uncle Tom's Cabin deserved praise for its virtually unquestioned role in the abolition of American chattel slavery and for its path-breaking portrayal of black dignity, emotion, and virtue. On the other hand, the hardening of Jim Crow at the turn of the century meant that conditions had not improved nearly as much as they should have. Amid the South's pervasive arguments that black Americans were unfit for civil rights, its increasing legal and extra-legal efforts to create a socioeconomic order as close as possible to slavery, and Northern assent to these attitudes and policies, there was a powerful onus for African Americans to prove just how far from the days of Uncle Tom and from Uncle Tom himself the race had progressed. While African American protests against Uncle Tom's Cabin itself would not arise until the late 1930s, and I'd be happy to say more about that in the question and answer period, Uncle Tom's pejorative meaning developed during the 1910s as a new generation of African Americans struggled against the race's old political attitudes and strategies. This negative meaning developed through association not just with the meekness of Stowe's character, but more importantly, with a fraught slavery past to which succeeding generations of African Americans negotiated complex and shifting relationships. By the 1920s, aided by demographic, educational, and cultural shifts that increased intraracial tensions, calling someone an Uncle Tom was an unmistakable slur. It became an entrenched part of African American political rhetoric, deployed to criticize those whose attitude or behavior worked contrary to the race's progress. Calling out Uncle Toms was a way to reject the legacy of slavery and insist that a new kind of leadership was the key to progress. We are still, of course, wrestling with the legacy of slavery. It is for that reason, I think, that the term Uncle Tom remains so controversial and is still used. It is also why telling the story of Josiah Henson is so important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spengar. Very good history lesson there, things that I did not know. And we need to make sure that more know about this. So really appreciate you here with us today. Stephanie Young is up next. Let me tell you a little bit about her and the reason why she ran in, and a reason why she's going to end up running out is because she is President Obama's primary liaison to the African American community. And as you know, things are pretty busy over at the White House these days. She is also the former communications director for the Congressional Black Caucus during the 112th Congress. Stephanie, we're so honored to have you here, and we appreciate your time. And please, we'd love for you to share your thoughts with us this morning. Thank you.
So much. And thank you for forgiving me for having to run in and run out to the panelists. I know that you all are going to have an excellent conversation. So the first thing I will say about the legacy of slavery that I think has been challenging for us as a nation is just simply talking about it. I've been in so many different offices throughout my political career, and talking about slavery makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Doesn't necessarily make me uncomfortable, but it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and it's incredibly important that we don't gloss over it, and we don't act like it never happened, but we all talk about it, and we all talk about our personal experiences with it, especially if we know any personal history about our family. My grandmother was born in 1913 to sharecroppers in Georgia, and I know that they worked that land for a long time, so I can only imagine that her grandparents were slaves just because of her age, and her parents potentially were slaves as children. So at the end of the day, we're just not that far removed. And I think sometimes as African Americans, we act as though we are, and that it was so long ago, but we carry all of these traditions and things with us every day, and I know that I do. I'm also a product of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and that church was founded through a runaway slave, someone who actually, I'm sorry, it's not a runaway, but he paid for his freedom and started a denomination when he felt as though we were being discriminated against in the Methodist Church. So I come from a deep tradition, and I think that when you do have that foundation, it's easier to acknowledge and also be proud. As far as I think what this president has meant, even though he's not necessarily the descendant of a slave, or slaves rather, his wife is, and he acknowledged that way back when, in 2008. I still remember the day that he gave that speech on March 18th. Actually, it was 2007, I believe. It was in Chicago, and he talked about race. And I remember I was working at the NewsHour Jim Lehrer on PBS at the time, and I remember hearing him speak and looking at some of the other Black folks in the room, in the newsroom, and just feeling like, oh my gosh, I've never heard a Black person speak about race like this before publicly. It was almost like he brought that conversation out of the closet and spoke about it in a way as though to make you feel like my voice is being heard. He's speaking for me, he's speaking for us. And so much pride, but also so much relief in that moment, because he really, I think, opened the eyes of so many people who might not have been tolerant, didn't want to really hear about it, and really maybe just didn't even think about it from their own experiences. And I think that's what's been so powerful about this presidency and this administration, simply the imagery, simply, the history of where they come from, and knowing, that slaves built the White House. And the First Lady just said that a couple of days ago during a speech when she was giving a commencement speech in New York, but just simply making that acknowledgement, because we want to sweep it under the rug. Henry Louis Gates, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with some of his work on PBS, he mentioned, he didn't mention, but he did a series about blacks in Latin America, and he called it the Black Grandmother in the Closet. I almost feel like it's slavery in the closet here in the United States. So from the Chicago race speech all the way to Charleston, South Carolina, on Friday will be the 1-year anniversary of the Emanuel 9 shooting, and the president went down and did a speech where he talked about bringing down the Confederate flag. And I just rewatched it the other day, and I was in the room at that moment, and the energy in the room, and just the fact that we had an African-American president talking about how painful the Confederate flag is to see, how scary it still feels for us to see, again, felt like someone was speaking for us in a way that's never been done before. But he stood up and said, the cause for which that flag is erected is wrong. Slavery was wrong. And I know other presidents have said that before, but in that moment, it meant so much to me personally, but I know it meant a lot for the folks in the room. And then also, again, when we talking about it, the Washington Post did an expose about the First Lady's family and traced her all the way back to, ironically, to South Carolina, to Georgetown, South Carolina, and talked about some of her earlier ancestors. And then my boss, Valerie Jarrett, who's senior advisor to the president, participated in Henry Louis Gates' Our African American Lives, where they traced her family, which has so many huge African American figures and firsts, but also her great-grandfather, who went to MIT, was the son of a slave who saved money that he got, that he received from his master, who was actually his father, and through his carpentry work. And then once he was freed, because this is right around the time of Civil War, he saved up even more money and was able to send his son to MIT, which is extraordinary to think about. So at the end of the day, we all have these stories. We're not all fortunate to know about them, but it's so important for it to be a part of the conversation, and it to be a part of the conversation here today, but also figuring out creative ways in which we can bring our children into the conversation. And I do think that there is quite a bit of content now that's emerging through programs like Underground on WGN, which we screen at the White House, and even Roots Reimagined by A&E, and really giving the next generation an opportunity to understand it, but to own it, and not to own it with a sense of shame, because I do think it's been associated with that, but a sense of pride. I'm proud to walk into the White House every day and know that I come from a strong people, and knowing that that parts of my family were enslaved here in the United States and never could have imagined a moment like this. And I think that as we continue to move forward, and as more people embrace that history in pride and instead of shame, I think that will do wonders. But back to my original point, talking about it is what's so important, and not sweeping it under the rug. So I'd be remiss if I did not thank the Josiah Henson Leadership Conference and Foundation, and everyone here today for having me. And I would also be remiss if I didn't speak a little bit to, really quickly, the criminal justice piece, which is such a huge issue for this presidency and for this administration, and the president has directed us to run through the tape on this issue, so it's no slowing down. I'm actually going to a meeting on criminal justice at 11:15 if I can make it there, and I'm saying all this to say that it's all interconnected, and we do understand that the issues that a lot of African Americans are facing now, and even the way that we work together as a people, has been influenced and has been touched by our history and our past. And I think that because of the president's personal history, he's been able to strike that balance and even open, I think, African Americans' eyes to looking at how and understanding how our white brothers and sisters and others could think of things differently, and it not come from a place of malice or hate, but it just comes from a place of just not being informed and not necessarily having to think about it. So I think that that we needed someone like this, and we needed a moment like this to really have that middle ground. But we're working hard to figure out what we can do on the federal side of things when it comes to our criminal justice system. So again, I thank you all so much, and I do apologize for having to leave. So thank you.
So again, Stephanie is with the White House. So we go with the flow. And thank you so much, Stephanie, for being with us here today. You've added so much to today's discussion. I know someone else who's really going to add to today's discussion, our Montgomery County Council member, Craig Rice. As we said earlier, he is the youngest African American to ever serve on the 9-member council and only the second African American man to serve in that role. Craig, you are constantly dealing with the issue relating to language and the community. So I know that you definitely have something to say on that topic. So come on over. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you. So, where do I begin? I think I should start off with a little bit of life history. I grew up here in Montgomery County. My mother is from rural South Carolina, a small little place called Roundo, and my dad from Hampton, Virginia. And I heard the stories as a young man growing up about the rural South and dealing with race and dealing with the challenges. So I heard it from my grandmother, who I was fortunate enough to be able to spend a lot of time with as we visited in the summers, but also from my mother. But I had a unique experience of growing up across the street from a gentleman by the name of George Haley. And some of you might know that name rings a little true because he was Alex Haley's brother. And so I had the opportunity to walk directly across the street and learn about roots. I had an opportunity to meet and spend time with Rosa Parks and talk to her about some of the challenges that she faced and the decisions that she made. And I think that oftentimes we forget about my generation. We talk so much about the millennial generation. We talk about all the different generations that are out there, but we forget about the one that's just removed. And I think that what you just heard about is so important because we also have a story to tell. Because we were the generation that came about right after the civil rights movement. So we experienced the change that happened, for good and for bad. I remember growing up and being in school when I was in the Magnet program, which was a gifted and talented program. And that was really when I first started to experience racism. Very upfront, to where because I didn't talk like some of the other kids, they called me Oreo. Called me Uncle Tom. We were the recipients, our generation, because it was very interesting if we think about it. Our parents were very keen on making sure that we didn't suffer the same sorts of discrimination that they experienced, and were so intentional and so purposeful in terms of making sure that we had every single benefit possible so that we could succeed, that we actually moved so far away from a lot of our culture. You know, and it's something interesting that I think that, again, we need to remember as a part in a context of our conversation. You know, it's one of those where still to this day, I'll never forget when I first started having the ability to call people and talk to them about business transactions. And so I'd call on the phone with one of my first professional jobs, and I'd talk to them, and then I'd meet them. And they'd look at me and almost faint because they did not think that Craig Rice was black. And I think that's important for us because still to this day, And I don't think that as a part of our language discussion, we realize that it's become ingrained in our society. People tell me, "You speak so well. You're so articulate. You're so well put together." And I think to myself, what else should I be? But the reality is that as I look at my children, I see that the language in our community has also changed to where we've gone away from the N word. But I just want you to reflect on one word and tell me what it is that you think about when you hear it. Ratchet. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about ratchet? A word that's infused in our urban culture, in our hip-hop culture, in our society as a whole, that we refer to other people as. And as the father of 2 young daughters, the reality is that when you think ratchet, you think of a young black woman twerking in booty shorts. But yet we use that. It's the new N-word, especially for our young black women. There are so many that are out there that we have now replaced. And it's interesting because now in our politically correct culture, we refer to people as hood, as urban. What do those words truly mean? What's behind those words? And what's the image that's portrayed when they're there? Because the thing about it is, we may have escaped a singular word in the sense of not using that particular exact word. But the meaning behind all these other words is still the same. The level of inferiority, the level of you are beneath me, that I expect little from you. And the problem is that our young children are learning those same sorts of things and referring to each other with those same sorts of words. And so the challenge is, by keeping and not checking the language usage, what happens is that we ingrain a new generation to continue to feel the same damn way. So what has truly changed? You know, it's interesting. It's one of the things that I thought about when we were writing my bio. And it's one of the things that I was always cautioned about and saying, well, you're the second, African American to serve in the role. You're the youngest African American. The problem is that that's a problem. That's a problem. When you think that in a community like Montgomery County, I'm only the second black man to serve on a 9-member council representing 1 million people that are a majority of color. What's wrong? And I say to you that part of the problem is that we still have a perception. When I first ran for office in 2006 for the Maryland House of Delegates, I knew when I walked neighborhoods in Potomac that it was going to be difficult for me to make sure that folks understood that I would be able to represent them. And so my team and I had a long conversation about this, and I made sure that I had a walk piece that showcased my family. Because the very first question, oh, that's very nice. Do you have a family? Well, what does a family have to do with the fact of me representing you and the ideas that are listed here that I want to make sure have happened? The reality is I'm less of a threat if I'm a family man. A young black man who's a single man who's out there is still portrayed as a threat. And so the key is that I think until we have truly redefined what it means to be a person of color, whether it's black or Latino, because we see that our Latino and Hispanic brothers and sisters have the same challenge. And now we're seeing it with our Muslim community as well. The reality is that we've come a long way, but a long way is really not that far. Because the challenge for us, and I want to give kudos to the First Lady, not just for her work, but also for her husband, who I have tremendous respect for and admire, is that being number two is so much harder. Because you have to live up to the expectations that were out there from the first, but then people also say, well, we've done that. And that's why I wish that Stephanie had been here to hear what my concerns are, because while I'm proud to have a black president, my concern is, will it ever happen again? And that's something that we need to keep at the forefront, because people will say, we've been there, we've done that. And will second guess anyone who else comes along, because they'll say, what else can you do different? It's those kinds of things that, again, are a continual part of what we live each and every day. Me, as a young black man who chairs the Education Committee, wants to make sure that I talk about my experiences so that my kids will truly be able to experience a better world. And we say that, all of us say that, but in reality, we have so much work to do to truly make that a reality. And so I look forward to engaging in this conversation, because I think that as we talk about language, as we talk about embracing the conversation about race and reality and what our expectations are, I'll close with a story that some of you may have heard before. About 3 years ago, it's been about 3 years now, I was at my local Giant. And Giant hates it when I tell this story. I had come from the gym. I was in sweats. And I had used the little automated system to log in all of my groceries, and had gone to the register and keyed in my little scanner, packed up my groceries, and was walking out of the store. And a young lady stopped me and said, "Excuse me, sir, did you pay for those items?" Now, again, this is my home grocery store that I go to probably about 2 or 3 times a week. I know a large number of the staff there and the management. And the reality is that after they had called the manager to the front, and I had been very upset about the situation, and they profusely apologized, I just want you to remember that was 2013, with a man who was a member of the Montgomery County Council, one of the richest councils in this nation, in charge of 1 million people and a $5 billion budget. If it can happen to me, what's happening to the rest of our kids? That's where we are right now. And that's how we need to do more work to make sure that we truly are changing the dialogue. So thank you.
Craig, thank you so much. I have to say this, you kind of just took us to church. Very important dialogue that we've begun today. I think that we can all relate to some of the comments. I know I was nodding when you were talking about how you speak. That happened so many times. And yeah, and it was recently, 2015, still happening. But nevertheless, I would like to thank all of our panelists. They're staying. They're not going because the conversation continues. At this time, we're going to take a brief break, and then we'll return to share more on the community discussion about language. How do we talk about the ripple effects of slavery, emancipation, and race relations in the 21st century? Stay with us.
comment to the bottom furthers discussion, and I've gotten to meet a lot of people that way and learn a lot from my readers.
Most of the time it's good, sometimes it's not so good.
I have an audience that I've never had before, and that's what I need. I want to feel like people are welcome and people are coming in to the classroom when they're reading this.
Create a web presence and share your passion by blogging at mymcmedia.org.
All right, welcome back, everyone. And thank you again for joining us for the Josiah Henson Leadership Conference. I'm Debbie Jarvis, your moderator and your host. Our distinguished panelists will now engage in a community discussion on language. How do we talk about the ripple effects of slavery, emancipation, and race relations in the 21st century? So let's get right to it. We'll have a discussion here, and then we will take questions from the audience. So what are the ripple effects of slavery and emancipation on race relations today? Who'd like to begin that conversation? Or basically continue on? Craig,
Well,
I'm going to call in.
I'll go ahead and start. Look, and I think you've heard from a number of folks on the panel about also some of the other ancillary effects of what we see when it comes to slavery. The reality is that the economic impacts that have continued historically have a tremendous impact on our communities. And so what I see it within our education spectrum, because when you don't have parents that were able to go to college, but when you also don't have parents who have high-paying jobs, who can afford that if their child is struggling to be able to send them to a tutor or be able to give them the extra resources outside of school that they need, we continue that perpetual cycle. And so unless we continue to really embrace the inequality that still exists from socioeconomic status that perpetuates all of the other problems, one of the key reasons why so many of our minority population are incarcerated is because they never got access to mental health treatment that was needed early and diagnosed so that they could get the support that they needed. We are treating people for mental illness in our jails. That is not the facility to give them the support that's necessary. And so until we change that cycle and really ensure that every single one of our children has access to a quality education that gives them that same starting point, and it starts with pre-K, then we are going to continue to see this cycle of inequality in our community.
Yeah. Melanie?
Back to the mental illness piece, a lot of the times, the first time that people are getting treated or being seen for those problems is when they're arrested and when they're brought in. So that's part of the problem too. I think it also goes to self-worth. You mentioned the word ratchet. Teaching our youth that they are worth something, that they are valuable, and not trying to emulate what they see on TV and hear on the radio and try to dress like the people in the rap videos. Just instilling in them that they're worth something and that they can do more. I think it comes from us to be leaders, to show them the right way. And it's a perpetuating cycle, like you said. A lot of people who are incarcerated, their parents were, and all of their friends, so that's all they see and all they know. So we have to expand their knowledge base.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess I would add a legacy of slavery that I've been thinking about a lot lately as an academic is the archives and resources of HBCUs nearby at Howard University or at Fisk. There are these places with really, really amazing collections that are super underfunded, which really limits the kinds of stories that we can tell. And that's something that I think doesn't get a lot of attention, but is really important to being able to tell stories about African American history, is to have access to those materials.
Well, speaking of having access, I was going to ask what can be done to change the perceptions about the Uncle Tom character, and it sounds like it is difficult. How difficult is it? But still, what can be done?
Well, I think, and this is actually something that we were talking about a little bit just a few moments ago, to me, it's less important that we say, okay, well, we need to change the meaning of Uncle Tom because that's not, really what this term means, but more important for us to talk about why this term changed meaning and what do we mean when we say that. There's just a lot of language that I'll hear from my students or from people around me, and I find actually that it's less helpful to say, hey, that's racist, and more helpful to say, well, what do you mean when you say that? What do you mean when you say Uncle Tom? And that really gets us to, the person who's using that term to thinking about what are the implications of using a term like that? What do I mean? And I think that a lot of times, the students in my classes really are afraid to talk about race, and it's important to be able to talk about it and to talk about it in a more nuanced way than saying like this word is okay and this word isn't okay, but to think about what does this word mean? What are the problems underlying that language?
Just staying on the Uncle Tom and the name and what it means, I know that, you said it, you've been called it, I've been called it, many here in the audience have been called it, you've been called it, okay. It's negative, it's a negative connotation that's affected people who have been called by it. How else has it affected folks? You've continued, you pushed through, you moved on, but some people can't.
The interesting thing is that yes, we move on, and this is a part of the conversation we were having during the break as well, but how does it really affect you? Because you still think about those things. Those same experiences that I had back in high school over 25 years ago are still with me and still fresh, and I can still remember them. And what the challenge is that in some cases it pushes people to then redefine themselves. And that's the very powerful thing about language and about how people describe you. It's one of the phenomenon that we see in social media when it comes to the bullying aspect. Words do matter, and they affect people in such great levels that we really have to empower our children, especially, to be able to do exactly what you said, to start to push back, to start to ask questions. Well, what are you trying to describe? What are you trying to say about me? But it also has to happen from us as adults. When we have a person who says, you speak so well, it should be, and I should speak how? Should be the next following question. What we've done in our politically correct society is try to avoid those kinds of conversations, when the reality is that all that does is perpetuate the misunderstanding and the racism still associated with those kinds of descriptions.
So for me, I grew up in Fairfax County, Virginia. When I was in elementary and middle school, I was probably one of the 2 black students there, but then I moved on to high school and there were more blacks and Hispanics and other minorities there. When I first started out, I was a cheerleader. I had all of my friends from my previous schools. I was called Oreo, white girl, all of those things, uncomfortable, crying, really upset. And then senior year, I stopped cheerleading. I kind of got cool with the other kids there, and then my other friends said, oh, we heard you turned ghetto. So I was never fully accepted by either group. I was very, didn't have a self-concept, self-confidence, didn't really know who I was as a person. So both of my parents, they went to Morgan State University. I went to Hampton University. So it drove me to find the HBCU, to reach back and really define myself for who I believe that I was and to learn my history. So I think it actually turned out to be a positive thing in the end.
Good, good. Dina, any thoughts on?
I think you guys just both addressed it so beautifully.
Okay. Well, tell you what, I think now is a good time to turn to our audience. I think there's some folks who might have questions. When you step up to the mic, please remember to state your name and where you are from. And I encourage you to keep your questions. Come on up. Don't be afraid of the mic. Yeah. Just keep your questions brief so that we can try and get other questions from audience members. So we're going to start with you. Please state your name and where you're from and your question.
Good morning. I'm Ruby Rubens, and I'm from here in Montgomery County. Each of the panelists have talked more about kind of the individual experiences that they've had, but I perceive even a bigger thing, an institutional and structural kinds of language and stereotype and code words that happen in our institutions and in our, that wasn't all. So how can we address the institutional and structural racism and stereotypes that so control how we see ourselves and the relationships between the races and cultures?
Let me just say that when it comes to, and I apologize, Debbie, but our media has
I'm no longer in the media.
I know.
I work at PepCo, so you go right ahead and say it, and I agree with you.
But our media controls a lot of that perception, and for something to truly be institutionalized, it has to be mass disseminated. And so if the continued stories that you see that portray, especially our people of color and our Black and Latino and Hispanic communities especially, is always negative, and that's all you see all the time, then that's what people will continue to expect. And so for folks who don't have the experiences of interacting with folks who aren't the example of what they see on television, that's what they're going to assume and continue to perceive about us. And so we have a responsibility, I think, to continue to push. And so especially our folks that are in the media, and we need to hold them accountable for what it is that they're doing and how they're continuing to perpetuate those stereotypes, because that's how it truly gets institutionalized. And then you have government leaders and people of power who see these stories and say, well, or read in the paper, well, see, these are the things that are happening, and so therefore I'm making these decisions based on what is happening. When in reality, that's not the true story. That's not what's happening in our community. That's not what we're seeing. And so it's from that perspective, I think.
Yeah, picking back off the media piece, I think recently it was in the Post or something. If you Google 3 Black teenage boys, mugshot pictures come up, because that's what the media is writing about. If you type in 3 white boys, pictures are playing sports, smiling, having fun. So we have to change the narrative, what media is writing about, and change those results, because people are getting their information and their knowledge from the internet. So Google different things. There was another study out about professional hairstyles. White, long, straight, ponytails came up, unprofessional hairstyles, afros. So people who don't have access to our community, don't have access to people who don't look like them, won't know anything different because they're going to the internet. So we have to change those results.
Don't we also have to change what's in our textbooks, what's in our history books, because who's writing them, and our school systems are buying them, and we have no control in the perpetuation of the history stories that are being taught to our children. So I think we ought to influence there as well. So how can we do that?
Thank you.
That's a very good point. And I think that also we have to remember that, again, as the same stories that we have told as individuals experience, that those are the same folks who are writing the textbooks, that are telling the stories in the media, that are doing. And so we can't just assume that because we're in 2016 means that every single person has an enlightened experience and is going to then portray that in a textbook, in a classroom. There are so many things that we continue to need to do to really redefine the narrative.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Great question. Great dialogue. Next question, please. Please introduce your name and where you're from.
Sure.
And state your question.
Cheryl Brissette Chapman, the National Center for Children and Families, Howard University School of Social Work. As I've listened to the panel, you're a great panel. I'm an English major, undergraduate. Language. This generation, we've talked millennials, but what about the next generation of younger children? We create stories. We use language when we're anxious, when we feel inadequate. And despite the resiliency of our children and the resiliency of the panelists, how do we create language that intentionally creates a sense of safety for our children? Without the sense of safety, we are not going to be able to help them take on the language of an institution that didn't exist when I was a little kid. we had one TV that came in and we could only watch on Sunday night, the animal show, and then we had to go to bed. So we have an institution that's unchanged and unaccountable, but what are your comments about what we can do to create language that's safe? Because in our efforts to be advocates, we're part of the problem. Our young people are anxious. They text because they don't want to talk to us. And what we have is always more, figure it out, do this, you can be. And at some point, how can I become rather than be what the world says I am?
Who'd like to take that first?
I mean, language is obviously something that I've given a lot of thought to, writing about literature and teaching literature. And I think that, I mean, and this goes back to the last question, I think, about institutions of racism, that in order to create safe language, we have to understand why the language that we're using right now is unsafe. And I really see my role in teaching literature as being a way to train citizens in understanding language and being able to look at a sentence that may seem like, you know, totally non-offensive, and then see, okay, well, what are the underlying assumptions that are going into this sentence? What are the ways that this language supports wrong thinking, basically? And I think that that's a conversation that is kind of getting lost in a way in our focus on STEM, you know, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, I think, are what they stand for, and that the humanities are a really important place for us to learn about history, but also for us to learn about what language is really doing, what kinds of values is it upholding, because only when we understand what problematic language is doing, how it's working, can we really understand how else to speak.
Let me just say that, you know, we as a community, and especially as parents, need to check our children. And I say that not lightly. My daughter, the other day, we were on a field trip, and she was with some of her friends, and, you know, when they were taking pictures, it was the 2 fingers up and the peace sign and all that kind of stuff. And I said, baby, why are you doing that? Why can't you just stand there and take a picture like the girl next to you? Why do you have to? Because unless you make sure that people understand what's associated with those kinds of things, and that's what we need to do, is make sure that we're educating them that you are feeding the perception, that perception of inequality, that perception of that you're not as smart as me, that you're not as good as me. And look, there you are doing those sorts of things. That's the part that we miss. We can have a conversation about what it means to interact with a police officer, which is important. But do we also have the conversation about what it means about how to handle yourself as a young black woman? And what that means and what those perceptions will follow you for the rest of your life are.
Absolutely.
I think from the criminal justice perspective, being safe, I think of not being killed or not being incarcerated. So the language I would always say to use is, I know my rights. We have to make sure that our kids do know their rights when they are in these encounters, and let the officer know that they know, so the situation can end differently. Know that you don't have to speak without a lawyer. Know that you can remain silent. You can refuse a search. All of these things are not taught in school. Just knowing your rights and making sure that that will lead them to continue to be safe.
Thank you very much.
Great. Good job. I do want to add this in reference to your comment about the media earlier. I want to commend MyMC Media for holding this dialogue, this conversation, because it's opportunities like this that will make a point and make a difference. So, thank you, MyMC Media. Next question, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Odessa Shannon, and I live in Silver Spring. And I'm very proud of my race. I'm proud because I know what they've done. I know where they came from. I know what they've accomplished. I know the inventors. I know the doctors, the lawyers, the craftsmen. But my concern is that those behind me don't know. I have a great deal of self-respect because I know that my people have accomplished, and they've come from nothing to the greatest position in the world, the president. But our kids, and Craig spoke to some of this, our parents tried to protect these people, the younger ones behind us, from knowing about slavery, but what those people who were slaves were able to accomplish. Black History Month has now become somebody standing up and saying, I have a dream. That's about all some of these kids know. And when I look at the audience, there are no children here to hear exactly what's been said by all of our panelists. So my question is, shouldn't this kind of program be made available in the schools, almost as mandatory during at least Black History Month, so that we don't have to hear I have a dream again?
Well, the good thing is that there is a link. So this is being live streamed right now, but we can go back to it. And to your point, I'm going to turn to Craig for the answer to that.
You know, let me just say that, and it leads back to the same question that we heard before about making sure that our children learn about what it is. The reality is that when you hear about Black History Month now, and you're so right, it's Steph Curry, it's LeBron James, and you say to yourself, so, because if we keep our sports figures as our Black history, then that means that's all we can do and accomplish. And if we're not talking about the other stories, about the myriad of great African American Black folks that have been able to achieve so many great things in our world, that have contributed to our society being uplifted as a whole, then we're lost. And it needs to be mandatory. You couldn't be more right. That's a part of changing that continual narrative about who we are as a people. Because our kids, that's all they see. It goes back to, and I have to still, and Debbie, you're right, you know, our community media isn't at the same level as our mass media in terms of its ability to tell the true story. They don't have advertisers and others that are pressuring them to have a certain message be out there. And we have to call it for what it is. The reality is that they don't want to hear stories like that. If they did, they would do that. That's right, but in the schools we can. In the schools where we have control, we need to insist, and it also comes from us as a community, making sure that we're communicating with our principals that are the bosses of our schools to make that change. We need to have parents that are engaged in our PTSAs. Because when you look at your PTSAs, interesting, you go to any school that's got over a 50% farms rate and tell me who the leader of that PTSA is and whether they're Black or white. Those are the kinds of things that, again, we need to talk about in terms of making sure that we continue to change that narrative.
And also invite classes to programs like this.
Absolutely.
Bring in a high school class or a middle
And
school
bring these
class
programs
or an
to the
elementary
schools as
school
well.
class so they can hear.
That's right.
Okay.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish we could continue on because this conversation is great. You guys have been phenomenal, our audience phenomenal, but we do have to come to an end. But not before we hear from our First Lady again. But I do want to say thank you very much to everyone. Our dialogue on language, how do we talk about the ripple effects of slavery, emancipation, and race relations in the 21st century. I want to thank all of our panelists again for all of your thoughts and your reflections and your lessons in leadership, and we have truly learned today. Again, PEPCO has been proud to bring you this engaging educational experience and to partner with you, with IMC Media, and working together in solving our shared challenges and in celebrating our accomplishments. Thank you again for joining us for the second Josiah Henson Leadership Conference. And now I'd like to call back up to the stage Catherine Leggett, our First Lady of Montgomery County. Thank you. Thank you.
One man, Josiah Henson, made such a difference in the lives of each and every one of us. And look at the conversation that was created today. The goal for the interpretation of the Josiah Henson Park is to accurately portray his life and the Maryland slave experience, as well as to explore the book that you talked about so eloquently today. This two-part conference is the first major adult education initiative for us, and we will have more. We hope that you learned a lot. The first part of our conference, which examined the topics of the relevance of engaged leadership and activism and heritage and history equality, you can find on the web at mymcmedia.org. Today's proceedings will also be available to us in a few days. Now, as the chairperson, I am heading up a committee of Montgomery Parks Foundation to raise $2 million to create this vision. If we are successful in reaching our goal, Montgomery County will match it by $5 million to construct the facility. So we have to raise the money. If you would like to help make this exciting project a reality, this meaning project a reality, this incredibly important project a reality, there are many ways to give. You can give of your time, you can do a naming, you can call us, you can contact us on the website and join the team. We all can make this park a reality and a lasting legacy for our future generations. Please, please, please contact the Montgomery Parks Foundation, and I believe the email address is on the screen for more information. You can also volunteer various roles at the park, ranging from archaeology to hosting student groups. You can find, again, more detail on the web. If you'd like to visit the Josiah Henson Park, you can just call us and we'll arrange a visit for you to come and tour. As my last order of business, I would like to thank Montgomery County Media and Montgomery Parks Foundation for hosting this conference. I'd like to thank the individuals of the committee who are here today. Julie Carter, Mike, our executive director, thank you. Debbie, you did a phenomenal job, so thank you, and PEPCO, thank you so very much. And most importantly, I want to thank each and every one of you who are here today and who are listening and streaming. This is an incredibly important project, and we need your help. So please join us as we forge forward to ensure that this park happens. Thank you so very much.